The planned dam in the Tibet Plateau is said to be the world's biggest hydropower project, but the impact of the 60-gigawatt hyperdam's construction and operations will have serious implications for India and Bangladesh.
It's very unhelpful of China not to share publicly what their plans actually are. I'd say this is most likely a run-of-the-river dam, which doesn't fully block the river's flow.
It becomes very crucial for India and specifically to the lower riparian Bangladesh.
So it's a question really of whether China's going to be open to share the ecological data with India, not just the water levels from the dam.
The line of actual control runs just a few kilometres south of where this dam is planned for. So that feeds into the security situation that in which India is acting, and that leads to sort of more securitization, more militarization attached to dam building.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Devi Gopalan. Is China set to weaponize water as it attempts to construct what experts say is the riskiest megastructure ever built? The planned dam in the Tibet Plateau is said to be the world's biggest hydropower project, which Beijing hopes will take it towards its 2016 carbon neutral targets. But the impact of the 60-gigawatt hyperdam's construction and operations not only upsets the area's ecology, but will have serious implications for India and Bangladesh. The dam's location, the Yarlung Tsangpo River, becomes the Brahmaputra River as it leaves Tibet and flows south into India's Arunachal Pradesh and Assam states, and finally into Bangladesh's Jamuna River. Now, to understand the enormity of this project and its consequences further downstream, we're joined by Alexander Davis, who's a senior lecturer at the University of Western Australia from Perth. He's also the author of The Geopolitics of Melting Mountains and International Political Ecology of the Himalaya. Great to have you on the program, and I'm going to start with this question. How big is big?
Very good question. Thank you, Divya, and thank you for having me. So, how big is this dam? So it's important to begin by emphasising that the full plans for this dam have not been released, and that the secrecy that China is instituting is fueling the anxieties about the dam, particularly within India. And I think that's very understandable. It's very unhelpful of China not to share publicly what their plans actually are. So, but how big is big? Based on what has been released and what discussions have been within China, and based on the ecology of the region, I'd say this is most likely a run-of-the-river dam, which doesn't fully block the river's flow. I've seen a lot of news reports in India and the West which are assuming that this dam will, because it's so big in terms of its power generation, will have a massive reservoir. But I think that's probably not the case. And that's because of the ecology of this region. What's more likely is that they will partially block the river and divert water into a tunnel or a series of tunnels. That's where this dam is sort of kind of engineering genius in a way, and there's only one place in the world that you could do this, and it's the Great Bend on the Yarlung Tsangpo River. So the Yarlung Tsangpo River flows through Tibet for 3,000 kilometres, and then it turns sharply before it goes into India. When it turns, it also drops 2 kilometres in height. So what they will do, probably, we can't be 100% sure on this, is partially block the river, divert water into a series of tunnels that will spit that water out down the other side of the Great Bend, which means it doesn't have a reservoir and it doesn't give them enormous amount of control over the water's flow. The drop of the water over that 2 kilometres will enable them to create an enormous amount of hydropower. So it would be the world's most powerful dam, but it wouldn't necessarily be the world's biggest dam. And that has quite important geopolitical and ecological implications.
All right, so before we dig deeper, China has constructed multiple hydropower stations along the course of the Yarlung Tsangpo River over the past decade as a source of renewable energy. William Nichols is a hydrology and remote sensing environmental risk consultant and has been researching that area in Tibet. And he uses satellite imagery and data to explain this sudden and unusual surge of activity.
In 2011, we had the approval of the 12th five-year plan, which involved an intensification of the hydrology in the Tibetan plateau. I mean, it's basically a high-altitude hydropower intensification that started taking place there. And what we initially saw was the building of the Zhangmu Dam, which is a run-of-the-river dam, so it effectively allows the river to run through, but that does have ecological consequences because they will be holding the water back and you'll have sediment build up in the dam as well, which does need to be managed, and we don't really understand, or there isn't any information that's easily accessible for understanding how the Chinese are managing the ecological aspects of the dam, whether there's processes that they have in place, which they may have, that they're not telling us. Now, once they finished the Zhangmu Dam, they started working on the Dagmu Dam, which basically, over a period of 3 years, we see an intensification of the dam hydrology here. So what we're seeing is that the Chinese are building these dams at a faster pace. So we're seeing the speed and the process under which the dam is being executed. All the equipment and the machinery and the infrastructure is in place. So they're just left with now just one dam to finish, went of the Jishu Dam, which has popped up maybe 3 kilometers, 4 kilometers along the river bend here. Now, from the Jishu Dam, we go maybe 4 or 5 kilometers further down the river and we get to the Zhangmu Reservoir. And another 3 kilometers down the river, we see the Jaisha Dam, which has already been completed. There are a number of further dams that are planned down the river that haven't actually started yet, and a range of dams that are planned further up the river that may link into the South-North Water Diversion Project. This is the status of the 12th five-year plan approval. So with the Great Bend, we probably will start seeing some of the feasibility studies approved and the planning and implementation stage, which will start taking place. So it's a question really of whether China's going to be open to share the ecological data with India, not just the water levels from the dam.
How closely would you say India is watching what's happening? Or as we can see there, we can now start tracking some of the activity there. How much is India looking at this, and how critical is it for them to understand this progression?
Yeah, they're definitely watching very closely. When that stretch of dams was built around Zhangmu, from memory around 2008, India started to increase its own plans for hydropower projects on the section of the river in Arunachal Pradesh where it's known as the Siang River. So India is operating in this what an international relations person would call a very securitized environment. They see China's dam building projects as a threat to India's national security, and so they think about the river, at least in part, in terms of India's national security. And what happened when those dams in Zhangmu and that cluster of dams were built was that India decided that its own plans for dams on the river needed to get bigger and needed to be built more quickly. So there's quite explicit evidence that so India had plans for a Siang Upper Hydro project near a town called Yingkiong in Arunachal Pradesh, and because this dam, it was actually stopped by local protest, and also because it's a very difficult area just to build major infrastructure in, just in terms of its ecology. Their plans got bigger, and they thought they needed to make the dam quicker, and they needed to build it larger because they were worried that China would stop the flow of the river or divert the river entirely. So China's dam building leads India to build bigger and more risky dams of its own.
Right, and speaking of riskiness, this Megadam is built just kilometers from the line of actual control on the disputed India-China border in Arunachal Pradesh, as you said, where other dams are now being built. What are India's concerns regarding the disputed border, and how does that play into the bigger tensions that are happening?
It's a region where the border is very actively disputed. So we saw in 2020 when China had more border incursions with India in the Western Himalaya in Ladakh, or in Sikkim near Natula, and in Arunachal Pradesh as well. You've had Chinese incursions over what is known as the line of actual control. The line of actual control runs just a few kilometres south of where this dam is planned for. So that feeds into the security situation that in which India is acting, and that leads to sort of more securitization, more militarization attached to dam building.
So how will the Megadam Dam impact India's Brahmaputra River, which is a major source of water for the nation? Neeraj Singh Manhas is a special advisor for South Asia at the Parley Policy Initiative. Take a listen.
It is very much a very essential river because of its because large number of northeastern states specifically, they are dependent on this river because of its dependability of drinking water and catering the other agriculture needs, because large number of agriculture, like for example the tea, the cotton, and paddies, etc., are being grown on because of this river. So it becomes a kind of a lifeline to the northeastern states, and specifically, this is becoming a news or the headline because it's very much near to the LAC border, and it just apart from that, also we have seen large number of activities taking place on the dam. So it becomes very crucial for India and specifically to the lower riparian Bangladesh also. Both the countries right now are in stage of contesting, and confronting this unilateral decision of China of making a dam on the lower reaches of Yarlung Tsangpo. It will definitely impact the ecological and the agricultural needs of the downstream countries. And in case of India, India is known to be a middle riparian country because lower to India is Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is a lower riparian country to India. And seeing that kind of a position, we need to see that China is on upper top, having its high altitude, and river is coming in a very from upper riparian to lower riparian. So things gets very messy at this moment because there is no joint river commission, or there is no proper water treaty between all of these countries. So it becomes very difficult to manage and to have a common ground where a dialogue can be made with China or to fix the things.
Right. So if we look at then just down to source of water, I mean, this will of course create a lot of geopolitical tensions. But when we look at the millions or hundreds of millions who will be affected by this as we go downstream, what would you say would be the immediate impact of this dam, the Megadam Dam, if it were built in the way you think it could be? And I know a lot of this is speculation, but as just a part of the river as opposed to the entire river being dammed.
So the impact would be, so environmentally, locally, there will be problems. Even without the major reservoir, you'll still limit the flow of water around the Great Bend, and that does have important environmental implications. So that one element of that is silt production. This is I think it is actually the siltiest river in the world, and that is partly because of the water flowing through the Great Bend in the river. And so the water, because it's dropping so rapidly, it sort of pounds into the rocks, and that breaks the rocks up and produces silt. That silt is really important for agriculture in Assam, in India, but it's also really even more important for Bangladesh. So when the river floods, it deposits silt, and that literally replenishes Bangladesh's land. Bangladesh is an extremely low-lying country, and with climate change and rising sea levels, it's literally being eroded into the ocean. But it gets at least partially replenished by floods from this river system. So if you limit silt production, or if you build an enormous dam that blocks silt, like your remote sensing expert was talking about, then you will literally make Bangladesh smaller and more likely to sink into the ocean. So the impact on Bangladesh would be enormous. But the bigger impact would be political, in the sense that because India doesn't know exactly what China's dam is going to be, they understandably get very nervous. And I see in Indian political discourse, in India's foreign policy elite, in India's media, a lot of commentary that this is the world's largest dam right next to our border. Which it is the world's most powerful dam, but it's probably not the world's largest. If India overreacts and builds an enormous dam a few 100 kilometers downstream, then the environmental impacts will be just far, far worse.
And speaking of environmental impact, the area the dam is being built is said to be earthquake prone. How much of a concern is that? And is there any way of mitigating any effect or possible future earthquakes to ensure safety and security in the area?
Yeah, that is an enormous risk, and I personally don't see how that risk could be undone or even necessarily mitigated. So if the dam were to have an enormous reservoir, the gravitational pull of that water can contribute to earthquakes. But there's a murky relationship between dams or any human activity really and earthquakes. So large dams in the area could make earthquakes slightly more likely or make an earthquake that was already going to happen more extreme and worse. Now, if you have an earthquake near a mega dam that does fully block the river, then you're looking at something catastrophic, because the dam cracks, all of that reservoir and all of that concrete splashes down the river and just washes away bridges, towns, people, livestock, everything. And it would go all the way down through Assam, Arunachal Pradesh into Bangladesh and be extremely destructive. If it is a run-of-the-river dam, which doesn't fully block the river or have a massive reservoir, then the risk is quite a bit lower, that you wouldn't have that reservoir splashing down the river. We saw this in India and Sikkim back in late 2013 when a flood caused a dam to collapse, and that was a really destructive flood in that region.
China, regardless, is taking a huge risk, as you said, but also China has been taking these countering these risks with engineering feats. And so Ruth Gamble is a senior lecturer at La Trobe University, Melbourne, and she's currently writing a book on the history of the Yarlung Tsangpo. And this is her take on what's spurring China's focus on these engineering landmarks.
I think that building this dam is seen within the Chinese public, or like the Chinese scientific community and engineering community, as like the same as going to the moon. It's an incredibly difficult engineering feat, and they've been developing their engineering capacity in dams way beyond what anyone else in the world is doing. So the whole idea that you can develop what some people, not me, some people in the Indian media have been saying is a water weapon. That wouldn't be one massive reservoir. But if you have small cascading dams, then that can alleviate some of India's fears, and possibly, and like a big possibly, have less effect on the particular and unique environment of that region.
Now, given the connectivity of the water sources, why hasn't there been a water sharing treaty among China, India, and Bangladesh? And I also want to get your take on Ruth Gamble using the term water weapon. What do you make of that?
Well, I'll start with water weapon. I think Ruth was very careful there to say that he's not saying that. So this idea of dams being a water weapon, it's quite common in political discourse, particularly in India. But it's a term that sort of causes panic. And this dam, as it's most likely designed, is not going to give China the capability to block the dam, to block the river, and then unleash that water to flood India. So I would personally avoid using those kinds of terms. That contributes to securitizing the watershed. The worst possible outcome in this kind of scenario is a competitive dam building on both sides of the border that could contribute to the entire hydrological system breaking down. There is no way for any state or political actor to win in that kind of scenario. So it's very important, I think, to it'll be very useful for the Indian government to start using remote sensing to see what is actually being done. It would be very helpful if China would just say what their plans were, but it's important to try to approach this as calmly as possible with and limit the militarization as best as possible.
Right, you mentioned remote sensing, so let me bring you this. Now, the Tibetan plateau can be hard to fathom. Its mountain peaks stretch kilometers into the sky, while canyons below sink so deep that few people have ever been able to reach them. But advances in satellite imaging technology give us visual access to the area. Hydrology and remote sensing environmental risk consultant William Nichols tells us how China's construction can now be tracked, regardless of how remote or inhospitable the region is.
We can see what's taking place in China with a lot more clarity than before. So in 2010, no one really had any vision or any eyes on any of the areas of the river that we're talking about. But now we're seeing constant satellite imagery coming through from the Copernicus program that allows us to view the river every 12 days. And synthetic aperture radar allows us to see quite a range of detailed processes which are hidden to the human eye. And the new NISAR satellite that's going up, which is part of the an Indian Space Agency and NASA program, is going to be able to see much more closely on river ecology. So they're introducing an S-band development, which is a wavelength which isn't currently available, that should be able to determine the boundaries of riparian zones with much more detail. It's under these processes we'll start to see much of the discussion between India and China, because India will have greater eyes and visibility on all the steps that China's taking when it's building this dam. If it can build it, there should be open discussion with India and Bangladesh about the ecology of the river. It's about the responsibility of China to share some of the processes it'll implement to mitigate some of the construction impacts it will have on ecology to Bangladesh and India, and the effects into the Brahmaputra River.
So how would you say India can take advantage of this greater visibility now to be able to prepare for what China is doing, or perhaps start dialogue?
Well, it's very hard it's proven very difficult for these countries to come together. Hopefully, increased scientific research and monitoring in the region might enable more cooperation. There are some examples of science-based cooperation across the Himalaya that are quite hopeful. There's an organisation in Kathmandu, a multilateral organisation called ICIMOD, the International Centre for Integrated Mountain Development. So they circulate scientific knowledge around the region. So there is some degree of collaboration between these countries through that organisation. But scientific knowledge has to be channeled the right way through political networks, which can often prove to be extremely difficult to do. But hopefully, increased satellite monitoring would enable India to have a clear-eyed look at what is happening and respond accordingly.
And from your point of view, as from the international relations, I guess, lens, what would be the best case scenario here for India and China?
I find it very difficult to imagine a best case scenario, unfortunately. What I think would be best would be integrated governance networks that were sponsored between nations, between states, between India, China, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, the countries of the region, that would listen to scientific knowledge, but that would also listen to local and community knowledge. So I think that environments are protected best when there is harmony between traditional ecological knowledge, the knowledge that communities from Tibet, from Arunachal, the Adi community of the region, the Pemakopa community from the region, when those voices are synthesized with and integrated into a shared international governance. That is the best solution that I could imagine. I don't find that particularly likely at the moment, but that is what I would advocate for. So increased scientific knowledge and increased local knowledge and empowerment being built into international and environmental governance.
So how would you say the dam is connected to broader Chinese development in that region, in the Tibetan Plateau?
So to understand what China's doing more broadly in the plateau, you need to understand something about the state ideology of ecological civilization. When I say ecological civilization to my students and colleagues, they think, oh, that sounds lovely, that sounds really nice. It sounds like us living in harmony with the environment and incorporating nature-based solutions into environmental governance. But what it's actually mostly aimed at is dividing the world up and fencing off zones for human usage, zones for environmental protection, and zones for food production, zones for energy production. So they're urbanizing parts of the plateau, particularly this city called Ningchi, which is a little bit lower altitude. So they plan on settling more lowland Chinese populations in that area. Now, they've also set aside ecological protected zones very close by to where the dam is going to be. Now, it doesn't make sense to me to do all of that, to set up environmentally protected areas, to urbanize parts of Tibet, and then straight away turn around and say, all right, well, we're going to build a massive reservoir now, so we're going to flood all of that, we're going to throw all of that out, which is one of the reasons that I think the dam is more likely to be a run-of-the-river dam.
Great, thank you very much. Alexander Davis from Perth, Australia. And for our viewers everywhere, it has been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.